Welcome to For the Record, where we provide deeper insights into articles from Atlantic Business Magazine. This episode, Dawn Chafe and Ashley Fitzpatrick discuss Atlantic Canada's marine industries. Hi, Ashley.
Hi.
Thanks a bunch for joining me. Really appreciate you being here. It's the inaugural episode of our For the Record podcast.
It's an exciting time.
It is indeed. So as you know, we're going to be using these conversations to provide some deeper insights into the journalistic content that makes Atlantic business so special. And of course, this inaugural one, we're going to be talking about the work that you just did for our November issue, that big, extreme, special editorial package that you did on the marine industry. And we're talking specifically about port electrification, port of first arrival, and of course, the seafarer shortage. And none of these are new issues. They've all been covered by the media before. What was it about it that you felt deserved the Atlantic business treatment in a bi-monthly magazine?
You know, it's funny. I was actually trying to remember exactly where all these ideas kind of generated originally. And I recall a conversation that we had, and we were talking about the changing priorities or the changing focus for a lot of the encouragement from the federal government in particular of, businesses to do more with international partners, to do more international trade. And thinking from that as to, what are the big pieces that will affect businesses trying to do more with partners internationally. And of course, transport and of course, shipping came up. And then we started going down kind of the road of, okay, let's talk to some folks who are with the ports, who are with the shipping industries, who are with transport, to see what some of their bigger issues are. And some of them, are a little more not central to their, day-to-day operation, but they believe very firmly that they're going to be issues going forward. So something like electrification of ports, for instance, isn't, making or breaking whether or not a ship, lands with all of its cargo in a given day. But it is becoming more of an issue when we get into things like, greenhouse gas emissions and what sort of credits or demerits are going to be hitting companies. And suddenly there's new pressures on ports to offer things that can be very complex and difficult to instate. And so something that seems like it's a tiny side issue going forward can become something more significant. So right. Yeah, it's just talking to the folks who are involved, really. Right.
So thinking about port electrification and what exactly that is, I mean, what are we talking about here? What is this just about, ports that have, I'll say, cranes that are operated by electricity, or is it something about what they do on shore? What exactly do you mean by port electrification? Yeah,
so I think the biggest thing to start off with is that ports really are, especially some of the larger ports in Atlantic Canada, like their own little cities, right? There's quite a bit going on in a given day. So certainly electrification of equipment and some of the things that they're doing shoreside are going to be very important going forward for the port's own sense of responsibility in terms of being green and greenhouse gases. But more importantly, I think when we're talking about electrification, the really complex piece comes when you're trying to serve those ships that are coming into port. So these really large vessels, like I'll use cruise ships as an example, come in, and typically what's happened in the past is that they've run off of their own engines, they've run off of diesel fuels, the heavy marine fuels that can be quite significant in terms of pollution and emissions at the end of the day. And what they're looking for now is this offering of the ability to essentially plug in. They come and they park and then can operate off of electricity from shoreside, which not only saves on the ship's own emissions, which gives that company particular credits, but can save overall in terms of the environment and what's going out. So that's the starting point, but it does become quite complex and difficult when you start to look at how that's actually executed and done.
Right.
Yeah.
So your article brings up the fact that there are 6 green marine certified ports in Atlantic Canada. Halifax is kind of a standout in that regard, being, I guess, the most advanced of the ports here in the region in that regard. I can't help but ask, though, in this particular environment, so you think about, I'll say, Trumponomics and the fact that, decarbonization and climate change aren't really getting the same attention or in favor.
Yeah, it's funny we don't hear about climate quite as much.
We do not hear climate as much anymore. Is this really a passé issue? Like, well, why now? Why is it topical? Is this something that's sort of passed and we need to move on to the next issue?
Yeah, I think this actually goes back to that question of, why did we end up pursuing this for the magazine. And, a big piece of it was that in our own conversations, we were talking about how, we're not really talking about emissions the way we did, say, during the Trudeau years. And it didn't seem like there was as much of a push. But when we talked to the folks at Green Marine, and it's a body that really looks in detail at what ports and in particular shippers, but the facilities themselves are doing to be more environmentally conscious. And it's a very detailed process that they go through to certify operations. When we spoke to them, they said, even in the United States, where you would think that there would be even more of a pullback on these sorts of initiatives, the costly, purely for the environment type operations, that even in the United States, they're not seeing that pullback, that in fact, there are some funds that are still on the table. And more importantly, there are companies and ports that are going beyond what's available to try and start actions now to make changes that they know are going to become relevant in the next few years. That, Trump at some point is going to go by the wayside, and whatever comes behind Trump isn't going to be able to ignore the climate question any more than most people can ignore it today.
So what you're saying is there will be continued investment in port electrification and greening of ports in Atlantic Canada and beyond.
Well, right now that's what they're seeing. Like that's the organizations that look for these things worldwide is they're not seeing that pullback. And in fact, in some places, particularly in Europe, you're seeing a more rapid advancement of these kinds of extensive planning and expenditures that take a lot of time and effort and money, frankly.
Right.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next story in your editorial package, and it's about ports of first arrival. So these are ports that, CBSA, Canada Border Services Agency, certified that they can do inspections of international cargo as it comes in. And it's a really interesting topic because even though Canada has the world's longest coastline, we only have 5 first entry container ports in the country. That is just frankly mind-boggling to me, especially when you consider taking the port of Argentia in Newfoundland. It's a heavy industrial seaport, but any products that are coming in there internationally can't just go to Argentia. They have to go past Newfoundland to Halifax and then be inspected there to come back to Argentia. It's like a 1,600 kilometer round trip journey.
Yeah, it's quite the turnaround.
It's quite the turnaround. Meanwhile, a trip from, say, New York City to Halifax is about 1,000 kilometers.
Yeah.
That's a lot of inefficiency, a lot of time lost. It's got to be a lot more expensive. Why do we have just 5 ports, and are we going to get some more?
Yeah, and to me, this was also one of those things that we needed to follow up on because it was something that popped up in the news locally in Newfoundland and Labrador a few years back. And the Port of Argentia just happens to be one of the ports that's been more outwardly spoken, more vocal on the issue. But there are ports all around Atlantic Canada and facilities all around Atlantic Canada that are looking to see some movement on this because it is so limiting in terms of the few number that we have right now and the idea of how far you have to travel. And again, going back to what's likely to happen in terms of consideration of things like greenhouse gases and what's expended in those turnarounds, it's starting to become more of an issue than it ever was before. So that's your change element. That's really what's changing now, in addition to that idea of trying to do more business with Europe, trying to improve, our exchanges and efficiency of those exchanges. People want to go to the closest point to where they want to land their goods. Ultimately they want to get as close to the final recipient as you can get and minimize their transport, frankly, just headaches. Right. So this originally came up, you had to go all the way back, probably just post 9/11, and the federal government was looking at a way to very quickly and to a very significant degree heighten the security around imports into Canada in particular. So they instituted basically very large operations to check cargo coming in and out. That it was sort of a bit of a reaction to the terrorism fright of the time, and for good reason. There was legitimate concerns that they've been acting on. I don't think the CBSA has ever been kind of out of step with that, and it's why this question, I think, has been so difficult, because it's not as easy as them saying, sure, we'll just pop into a dozen more places and make this easier for everybody. Is again, as in most things, there's a little more to it.
I was going to say it really does beg the question of what's holding us back. Is certainly looking over the years, it's not as though, smuggling or contraband or drug running has lessened over time.
Yeah, and things like, they're looking a long list of things. They're looking for stolen vehicles. They're looking for, it's not just drugs. It's, the risks of all sorts of different types of illicit activity. And even commercial things. They want to make sure that people are following regulations and we're being conscious of what's coming in and out of the country in a real way.
Right.
And not just kind of a nod and a smile to the idea of it, right? Yeah.
So we have a relatively new federal government, and new prime minister in charge. All of this, I'm assuming, a lot of it comes down to money and resources. Is there any sign that there are going to be more resources put into ports of first arrival and expanding the number throughout across the country?
Yeah, I think this is another piece of why this is such an active issue and why we decided to sort of chase it for the magazine is because there is a change and there is new investment going into security services. And so the argument has been made that while you're making this new investment, that why not make at least a portion of that new dedicated costs, dedicated spending for equipment and for personnel for these additional ports of first arrival, that this can be a part of not just, us improving security generally, but making sure that that improved security comes with, efficiency and essentially helps Canada rather than is just another layer that we put on for, presentation to somebody towards the south. Yeah.
So the biggest and immediate part of this editorial package, of course, is the seafarer shortage. And, it's one of Canada's largest labor issues right now, and almost no one talks about it. So can you give me some idea of the scope of the issue and what people are looking at here? I mean, why we should be aware of and concerned about the seafarer shortage?
Yeah, and it's one of those things where we went in looking to talk about transport specifically because it kind of came from that kind of economic change that I mentioned earlier, that idea that we're going to do more with international partners. So, what does that look like in terms of the demand and meeting the demands, just in pure people, but the more we looked at this, it became clear that it wasn't just in transport, that there was an issue really across the board when you look at basically anything to do with seafaring, and that can run fisheries. That's, it's been talked about in terms of the Navy. I think once you look at sort of the daily news stories and you start to recognize it's popping up all the time, but just not talked about collectively. And the reason that it needs to be talked about collectively, as you learn the piece, is that it's really in the way that people are trained and sort of the unique aspects of how we bring about having a more robust workforce, that there does need to be dedicated consideration to the details of how you take this wave of retirees, which is really at the root of this, is a lot of people aging out of these jobs, whether it's captains or deckhands or, marine cooks or engineers. You've got this wave of retirees, and it's common across the labor board. I think when you're looking at, all of Canada, there's few areas that don't see this kind of retirement wave. But the difference here is that these things are so essential, transport is so essential to all other forms of business that it's really one of those ones that has to be at the top of your list when you're thinking about what to pay attention to first. And again, it goes back to that unique training and what's required to bring people to the level that you need in order to continue to operate the vessels that you have, let alone expand, right? That's even before we get into expanded patrols in the Arctic for the Navy and, an increased, East Coast fishery, more transport to and from Europe. None of that happens unless you have the people to make it happen.
Right. And I was fascinated in your article because you referenced this landmark study by the Canadian Marine Careers Foundation. It was released past May, and it said something like only 4 in 10 positions at sea are going to be filled in the next 5 years.
Yeah,
That's 60% vacancy rate.
It's pretty phenomenal. I mean, they're already looking, in 2024, they marked over 3,600 positions that were left vacant. And they mentioned that, 86% of the employers that they surveyed weren't able to fill some of their positions that they had open. And they were just looking for this, in this case, they were just looking at the movement of people and goods, that really zoning in on the companies and operations that are involved in that. So they didn't look at things like the Navy or the fishery in the same detail, or they're not included in those numbers. So the bottom line being that the need is significant, more than significant, to the point where the really unique element of this study, and the reason that we connected with them and made a point to have them in the story, is that they also dug into the whole gamut of the training process, and basically how are we feeding that need, and is what we're doing going to be enough to meet that need? And clearly from what they found, it's not.
Right.
And the foundation itself, there are a lot of these kinds of surveys that sometimes come out, and we don't jump on them because they're sort of biased in one way or another. The really interesting thing about this foundation is the people that they have participating include Transport Canada. It includes, the independent corporations, but also the regulator, and also the folks who are responsible for, at the end of the day, making sure we can all still go about our lives and about our business.
Right.
So, yeah.
So ultimately, as I noted off the top, talking about this feature, it is a labor issue, which is human resources, which is people. So going in a slightly different direction, a September cold, wet, rainy, drizzly, typical Newfoundland day in September found you on the wharf in Brigus. Why were you there?
Yeah, I went out for the arrival of the Ernestina Morrissey, which some of the folks who were there will know, and a lot of the folks who maybe heard the news reports on the radio or saw the specials on the local television news in Newfoundland would recognize that, it's a historic vessel that was used for transport of goods. It was used as a research vessel for a time in the Arctic. It's got a really sort of deep history. It's an old schooner. So picture sails, picture, the old timey, almost a pirate vessel. It wasn't, but it was.
That would actually be hilarious. I would love that.
And the interesting thing about having something like that coming into the harbor is it was at the time being crewed by a group of students from the Marine Institute, Memorial University of Newfoundland. And so what I wanted to do was to sort of take this story and go right back to that idea of, the student who's just entered a program at university, and, why was it that they went in the direction they did? Why did they decide to hop on this vessel, which is meant to encourage an interest in seafaring, and is that where they want to take their lives? And basically just get a sense from that person who everybody is appealing to, right, of, do they even recognize at this point how much they're needed and how much they're surrounded by this invisible collection of people from all around Canada who are standing with their fingers crossed, just hoping that they choose the careers that they want them to choose and they fill the positions that are open, because there is such a need right now. And, it's important that every one of the students that has an interest is able to kind of go through their programs. Right. But it's a question of, do they feel that need and that support, and especially that support, are they going to make it essentially at the end of the day?
So I had the impression from your article, and some of the students you talked to, was like 2 of 3 of the highlighted students seemed like they weren't really sure about a life at sea, but one of them in particular seemed a little more enthusiastic. So I think that the experience probably accomplished what the people who organized it were hoping would be accomplished. But considering the environment today, so many people don't want to work in your office anymore, right? They want to work from home. They want to have flexible work environments. Granted, it is not the same environment as 100 years ago when going out to sea meant you were gone for a year or 2 at a time. But even so, in this environment, to ask young people to leave their home, to go away from home, to be away for a week, a month, 2 months at a time, that's not an easy sell.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you convince young people, or even get them interested in that kind of a career?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because you talk to some of the folks who are in sort of the peak of, different marine careers, some of the heads of these colleges, and asking them about, how they get their start. And, when they started out, it was common to see, folks, talking about marine careers, or you lived in a community where the ships were right there, and so it was only natural to think about those careers. I think now what we have is an industry or collection of industries that need the recruitment to go further afield. So they're trying to get to more folks who live inland, who, live in places that aren't normally associated with seafaring, and saying, look, if you have an interest in engineering, then, why not consider this type of engineering that could put you on a boat, and it's great pay and there's high demand for the jobs. And so it starts out with that recruitment piece. So that's really what they're working on a lot now, is giving
it's
people.
It's not the end, is it though?
No, it's not the end. At first you got to give people a sense that these jobs exist. Right. And so we're really, and I think that says something about the lack of focus that's been on this issue, is that we're still on that step one. We're still on that introducing more high school, early university age people to, especially those people, to what they could have as a career option. Then getting them through the program is a whole other thing.
Right.
So the support in that, there have been a couple of efforts on the part of the federal government in particular, to offer some support for people during their program. So things like relocation funding, and in particular for folks who are underrepresented in the industry.
Right.
So that was a part of the piece, is sort of to talk about, in Nova Scotia Community College, you've got a great, it's been great in terms of the uptake for that program, and it's a joint program with the federal government. At the same time, though, things like these supports tend to be short-lived, and the funding for that in particular will run out in a couple of years. And the people who are looking at these industries in need of people are saying, look, you need to either extend those programs to be longer and make it known that they're going to be around for quite some time, so people aren't humming and hawing on whether to jump into these programs, or make them permanent. Come out with some permanent supports that can be long lasting and make some real change in terms of having students who know they will be supported and know they will be able to finish their programs without having some kind of funding or support pulled out from under their feet midway.
Right. But just even being devil's advocate for a second. So they get the recruits. They have, support for the funding so that they can go through the schooling, and it's, subsidized and supported in there. But then, there's an issue on the ship side of things as well. So some ships don't have bunks for cadets. Sometimes you just cannot get the duration of the time on board ship that you need to get your hours in, because in Canada, so much of what we do is sort of short haul, travel, right, from place to place. And in some situations, so thinking about women on board ships as well, the smaller vessels, they're going to lack some facilities that, as a woman, I would find pretty crucial to have a bathroom on board. So how do we overcome some of these obstacles? And are I guess the powers that be aware of them? Are they working to overcome them?
Yeah, I think that when we think about the obstacles, is that, there are so many. So I think step one is just for any employer, keeping your ears open, being aware of what some of the common complaints are, and starting to take a look at them and address them. But you're right, is that there are obstacles with completing the programs. And I think it is a good point to make that, like I said, the powers that be have been aware of this for quite some time, and folks like the people at Transport Canada are very conscious of the shortage that is being faced. So they've been making efforts to put together some changes in regulation, for instance, that would give some more leeway and not in any way be lax and deprive people of those really intense learning experiences that are required, but maybe make it more manageable to develop educational programs around them, and to set those requirements, over certain periods of time that would be efficient and useful. The one that jumps to mind, and the reason that I'm kind of stumbling over it is it is related to women. I hate to keep jumping back to women, but there's regulation in relation to maternity leave that they're looking to make a change there, and essentially allow or make it less restrictive, so that women aren't essentially docked or don't have the challenge to complete the program that people wouldn't have if they weren't pregnant, frankly.
No. And there's also some cultural issues around women on boats as well, aren't there? I think you heard from women or through studies about women who were kind of ostracized a little bit for taking that time away and not being home where they belonged.
And there's a lot of different mindset on this, and it's for any sort of folks who find themselves in a more minority position in a workplace, I think, where it's a lot of people will rather just not sort of talk about it or not dwell on it, that the changes are being made and maybe more slowly than folks would like. or certain workplaces maybe jump out as being better than others. I think one of the big things that we found in sort of talking to people who haven't looked at this in further detail and done, extensive interviews and really dug into it, ultimately there are still real issues, and a lot of it comes down, like I said, to employers being mindful that there is the potential for a clash in terms of what the expectations are and what the reality is. And somebody said to me another big thing, and it is a big thing for a lot of people who find themselves in that more minority position, is not to be used as poster people,
Right.
that once you get into that workplace, that it should just be a normalized thing. And it's not a case of having to ask them to stand out and be on every poster, because you need to recruit more people from the general population. And that happens
Right.
to be an area where maybe you can get a few more people, right? The idea of needing people is universal. The best way to do it is to develop workplaces, I think, that are responsive, that are engaged with the needs of the folks that you're bringing on board. And there's no free rides, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you're not ignoring, the basics of the day to day.
Right.
Yeah.
It sounds like what you're saying is that a key takeaway from all of this is that awareness is the first step to a solution. And so, creating that awareness among potential, younger people moving into the workforce, of the marine life as a career, of companies, of governments, of educational institutions, all working together. So by, heightening that awareness, we're going to see more people interested, more involved in working towards solutions.
I think, the big credit should go out to a lot of the companies that are making changes, and you see it now in the differences between, the boats that you would have seen 20 years ago and what you see today.
Right.
Even the most basic things like connectivity, right? The idea that, if I work on board a vessel, I can remain in contact with, my family at home, in a fairly straightforward way.
Yeah.
It's not the kind of thing that you necessarily would have always seen 20 years ago even. So, the change is happening, and it's happening because people are recognizing the demands of work when you're at sea for extensive periods of time. And they're trying to find ways that keep people in that business. And there's no easy answers. That's the bottom line for all of this.
No, for sure. Well, thank you for all of your work on this, and I look forward to sharing it with Atlantic Business readers.
Thanks very much.
Learn more in the latest issue of Atlantic Business Magazine.